Exodus chapter 26, part 2. If you continue reading on, remember I was telling you from verse 3, 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and the other 5 curtains shall be coupled to one another, and you shall make loops of blue yarn. What was going on here was that this was the inner curtain, okay? Remember, basically what they had, when you're talking about Moses and the wilderness type situation, what they had was a portable tabernacle. This was not like the temple that they would eventually have when they got to Jerusalem. This was a portable temple. And what they'd have to do is they'd have to set it up. Then they'd do whatever worshiping they'd have to do in the whole 9 yards. And then they'd have to take it all down, and they'd have to go to another spot, set it back up again, and that's where they would worship. Okay? So, this was kind of, well, it's basically a portable worship center. That's basically what it was. And what was happening was that they would stop periodically in the wilderness, and then God would give them instructions on what to do until they got to their next destination. And once he told them where to go and what to do, then they take the tent down, they go to the next destination, they set everything back up, so on and so forth. That's why they had the rods. Remember those wooden rods that were supposed to carry the Ark of the Covenant and also the table of showbread? That's why they had those rods. You were supposed to carry this with you until you reached the next place where God was going to talk to you, and then you'd set up camp, boom, and then afterwards you'd take everything back down. You'd go on to the next destination until well, you get the idea. But the first thing God's talking about, these are curtains that were, you had an outermost curtain and you had an innermost curtain. And God was talking about in here the innermost curtain. He didn't want his curtains sewn together. That was the way it was. He wanted one long continuous curtain. And so the best I'm getting out of this is that these were laced together, okay? Because you're talking about here loops of blue yarn, okay? So you're talking about they were tying them together like you tie a pair of shoes together. That is directly contrary to sewing like you know sewing today. God did not want that. Alright, he did not want anything man-made touching his creation. Keep that in mind. When we're talking about these curtains here, they were made out of flaxseed. So again, this was not a synthetic material. God did not want anything synthetic in his worship center. He wanted everything to be God-made. God was making everything for the worship of himself. He didn't want anything man-made in this thing. Alright, and then it goes on. And you shall make 50 clasps of gold, which that would be the places where they loop the yarn together. Okay. And you'll couple the curtains together with the clasps so that they may be one tabernacle. Okay. So what was going on here was they would tie the curtains together with that blue yarn, again because God didn't want anything sewn, and then later on you're going to hear about how there was supposed to be cherubim on these curtains. Why was that? Well, what did we talk about in a previous video? In a previous video we talked about how the cherubims were the gatekeepers. And this was the innermost gate. Once you got past those cherubims, you were facing God. Simple as that. So that's why they had the cherubims the way they did. But we'll get into that later. You shall also make curtains of goat's hair to be a tent over the tabernacle. You shall make 11 curtains. Now keep in mind, curtains of goat's hair, these were goats with black goat's hair. Okay? So you had the first covering, which is the innermost covering, and now God's talking about a second covering that was going to go above and around the first. Alright? Now, why did God do this way? He first talks about the innermost covering, and then he starts talking about a covering around that. Well, that's because God deals with your insides first. Because the things that are inside of you will then manifest themselves on the outside. It's just like when sin gets into your heart. It contaminates the whole body. It starts in the inside and then goes out to the outside. Notice a lot of times Jesus was healing people on the inside because those inside things that were going wrong would then manifest to the outside. You will find in a normal human being that they will age on the inside first, and then you will see the effects of that on the outside. Okay? As things start to go wrong on the in part of your body, then it will manifest on the outside. Same thing with sin. What you think about on the inside will soon manifest itself on the outside. It's just like when kids learn curse words. They first learn them on the inside of their brain, and then later on it becomes a part of their speech. That's when they get into a lot of trouble. Okay? Kids have to learn curse words. They're not taught curse words. They don't learn them on their own. Okay? They are taught these things. Friends teach it to them, so on and so forth. They don't just wake up one day and start cursing all over the place. They have been taught this stuff. They have observed their parents. They have observed their friends, so on and so forth. It's just like somebody that consumes intoxicating substances. Here's a good example. When somebody first starts consuming intoxicated substances, like tobacco. Let's take tobacco for instance. You may not notice it at first. Oh, they cough a little bit. Oh, they have a little bit of a problem breathing type thing. That's an internal thing. Later on, you start seeing the aging of the skin, so on and so forth. You see the outward manifestations of what they've been ingesting on the inside. You see what I mean? It always starts on the inside first, and then it manifests on the outside. And the same thing works with Christianity. If you implant on the inside of people love, kindness, generosity, that kind of thing, then eventually it manifests itself on the outside. You have to first be filled with joy in order to manifest that joy. If all you're being filled with is garbage, then eventually that's all that's going to come out of you. And that's what happens to a lot of people. They're filled with such garbage that eventually it just pours right out. Let me tell you something. If you start pouring milk in a glass and you fill it up until it's past full, eventually it's going to go over the sides. It's going to spill all over the table. And that's what's happening to society today. You see this with people that watch YouTube videos all the time. Now, I'm not talking about the YouTube videos that you watch with me. I'm talking about YouTube videos that you see every day. Okay, I'll go through a whole big list of people that you know. But I'm telling you, there are YouTubers you really shouldn't be watching. They're sick. And when you ingest enough of that sickness, of course, it just spills right out. When I told people, I told people there was this cartoon, I was telling them that kids will start emulating what's in that cartoon. Oh, that'll never happen. I'm telling you, that the YouTube cartoon that was posted up on that internet, some kid will emulate one of these days. And when he does, it's going to put his life in serious danger. They just don't believe it, and they won't believe it until it happens. You know, they just had a thing about Amanda Todd. All the nasty comments that were shoved down her throat eventually manifested itself to the point where she went ahead and took her life. Instead of a lot of people filling her with good things, they filled her up with bad things, and eventually she broke. It's just like when you put a PVC pipe under a tremendous amount of pressure. After a while, it cracks, it blows up, and then you got a mess. Don't think it'll happen? Put a PVC pipe under enough stress and you'll find out for yourself. So like I said, when it comes to things manifesting themselves on the inside, eventually it manifests itself on the outside. And there you go. Alright, let's go back to the goat's hair. Now this is black goat's hair. Okay. The length of each curtain shall be 30 cubits, and the width of each curtain 4 cubits, and the 11 curtains shall have the same measurements. And you shall couple 5 curtains by themselves, and 6 curtains by themselves, and you shall double over the 6th curtain at the forefront of the tent. You shall make 50 loops on the edge of the curtain that is the outermost in one set, and 50 loops on the edge of the curtain of the second set. And you shall make 50 bronze clasps. Put the clasps in the loops, and couple the tent together that it may be one. Now keep in mind, 50 bronze clasps, 50 gold clasps. Those weren't coincidence. And by the way, bronze and gold? Are you kidding? Only wealthy people own that kind of stuff. These were a wealthy people. To make clasps like that, they were a wealthy people. To see churches in perpetual poverty is a sign that God just isn't there. Now, I didn't say that the churches don't go through tough times. Churches do go through tough times. But to see them, especially in our society today, going through perpetual poverty, not being frugal, but perpetual poverty, is a sign that God is not there. Churches prosper under God. But if a church isn't prospering, and I'm not talking about a short period of time, we're talking about it just goes on, and it's just never prospering. God's not there. Don't go to that church, because He's not there. If God's not in that church, then you don't need to be there either. And there are a lot of churches. There are a lot of churches that prosper, and there are a lot of churches that don't. And the ones that really don't prosper very well, on a long-term basis, not that they have a temporary crisis. Some churches do have a temporary crisis, but we're talking about they just never seem to get out of Povertyville. They're not real churches. It's that simple. Now be forewarned that sometimes when you have these mega churches, they may not have God either. They may be doing well in the short term. Be careful, because they could go on a downward spiral and end up being nothing. Just because they do well in the short term doesn't mean that they're doing well in the long term. Analyze them. See if they're doing as well in the long term as they are in the short term. Sometimes they have a short spurt of real wealth, and after that it goes boom. So just because the church is doing well in a short period of time does not necessarily mean they are full of God's glory, because they may not be. That maybe it's a temporary thing. You got to watch that too. Churches that do well in the short term don't necessarily do well in the long term. Beware. And finally, it says, you shall also make a covering of ram skins dyed red for the tent, and a covering of badger skins above that. The idea was to make the whole thing waterproof. Okay, it was to weather the elements. And ram and badger skin would make this thing waterproof. Because you didn't want a wet, holy place of worship. It didn't work that way. And for the tabernacle you shall make the boards of acacia wood standing upright. Okay. These curtains had to be placed on something, and what they were placed on were boards. Okay. So they would erect the boards first, then they put the curtains on top of them. And those boards had to be acacia wood. Why? Because acacia wood is sturdy. Remember I told you that in a previous video? Now, let me tell you something. When they erected these acacia wood boards, they didn't nail them together and all that other stuff. Okay, I know there was a way they put them together, but they didn't do it by man-made means. Because that's not what God wanted. Okay, 10 cubits shall be the length of a board, and a cubit and a half shall be the width of each board. 2 tenons shall be in each board for binding one to another. See? Thus you shall make all the boards of the tabernacle. Now, what is a tenons? Well, I'm going to tell you that in the next video. But this is what I'm talking about. They didn't take hammer and nails and hammer these things together. Besides, they'd have to pull the stuff back out when they were done, and they would have to take the boards with them. Remember, this was a portable tent. So God didn't want handmade anything. They didn't have electric hammers back then and electric drills that would drill screws into place. And besides, if you did hammers and screws and nails, putting them in and taking them out, that would eventually destroy the acacia wood. And God didn't want that. God had an idea for the way he wanted this thing constructed. Now, you say, well, what about the colors? Red was to represent blood. Blue was to represent holiness. Black was to represent death. Now, this would be the sacrificial death. Alright? So that's why those colors were there. So they were no coincidence either. Okay. So, I'm going to cover the rest of my next video. Hopefully you're kind of getting an idea of how this thing was constructed. And if you're talking about the cubits, you can go back a few videos and you can do all the measurements for yourself. But this was quite a structure. Now keep in mind, not only did they have to set up the linen curtain, and then the goat's curtain, and then the ram's curtain, and the badger curtain, but on top of all of this, when they took them back down, they had to carry these things with them. And these curtains would have been heavy. So that's why they had a lot of priests. They didn't have just one or two. They had a whole bunch of priests. And these priests would carry all this stuff. It was not an easy chore. So, I bet they were sure glad when that temple started getting built up. That way they didn't have to carry this unbelievable amount of stuff that they'd have to carry with them. Alright, I will tell you more in a future video, so stay tuned.